Good evening and welcome to BATV News. I'm Andrew Laidley. The IMF's mission chief to Jamaica, Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan, said she's disappointed with the island's recent growth figures and increase in poverty. She spoke exclusively with BATV's Kalila Reynolds in Washington, D.C. yesterday. Here's more.
In a candid interview with BATV News at her Washington office, Dr. Ramakrishnan says she's disappointed. Before July, there had been 9 consecutive quarters of growth, albeit very small and very slow, but now a decline.
It's a very unfortunate development, and we are disappointed to see that the poverty rate has in fact gone up. And it was also disappointing to see that the 9-quarter positive growth that we have been seeing over the last 2 years was broken with the small but still negative growth that was recorded in the June quarter.
Dr. Ramakrishnan notes that the economic decline and increase in poverty are both related to developments in rural Jamaica.
We have done a bit of analysis to see what exactly has been, what the data is showing, and what it is showing is that there is a dichotomy between the rural and the urban Kingston poverty rates. And what you're actually seeing is that in Kingston and in other urban cities, poverty is declining. So there is a 1 to 1.5% decline in poverty in 2015 in the urban and the Kingston areas, whereas in rural areas, there is a 4 percentage point increase in poverty.
So what's behind the increase in rural poverty? 3 words: agriculture and bad weather.
The reason why growth did decline is because of agriculture. The weather swings that Jamaica has seen, first there was a flood earlier, a drought earlier this year, and then there was a flood later in the year, and these are consistently hitting the agricultural sector. And if you were to extend that, the rural areas are therefore being hit the most by these agricultural swings.
The mission chief says they'll have to look more closely at making agriculture more resilient to these kinds of shocks.
So this actually does speak also to us in terms of policy, looking more at the agricultural sector and the resilience of the country to weather swings as we go forward in the reform process.
And that's been a big theme at this year's IMF meetings, increasing resilience to bad weather, especially in countries like Jamaica that depend heavily on agriculture and tourism. Meanwhile, the big item on the agenda at today's meetings was a meeting of the G20. However, that was a private event not open to members of the media. Finance Minister Autley Shaw also attended a meeting of the Commonwealth Ministers of Finance, also another private event. What we can report today, though, is the regional economic outlook, which was released this afternoon here at the IMF headquarters. They're predicting growth for the region. However, very important to note, that projection was made well before the hurricanes hit the region. That impact will be noted in the next report. Reporting from Washington, D.C. for BATV News, I'm Kalila Reynolds.
Justice Minister Delroy Chuck says politics has allowed the Jamaican Urban Transit Company, JUTC, to be overstaffed. He argues that many of the additional posts were created for political reasons. Minister Chuck was giving the keynote address at a meeting of the Rotary Club of Kingston yesterday. Kenny Gale has more.
Earlier this week, Managing Director of the state-run bus company, Paul Abrams, disclosed that the JUTC had about 500 more employees than it actually needed. Justice Minister Delroy Chuck is now arguing that those positions were created for political purposes.
So instead of meritocracy, instead of good sense, instead of good judgment, everything is a political judgment. And that is why you have today, it is reported that JUTC, instead of having 1,500 or 1,700 well-paid jobs doing the work of JUTC, you have an excess of over 400 or 500 jobs which were brought in, and I have no fear in telling you they were brought in for political reasons, because these people need a work.
He says politics is playing the major role in too many government projects.
And that is why you hear the Prime Minister yesterday complaining that a housing development, a 1-bedroom that was built for 1.2, and over the last few years, it continued. And those same one-bedroom houses that was cost 1.2 million, they were built at 11 million and had to be sold for 4 million.
That's why Minister Chuck says the country must now ensure that good judgment and sense takes precedent over political judgments.
It is quite clear to me, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to take a serious stance and demand that good judgment, good sense must take priority over political judgment, and where things are done primarily for political reasons. The garrisons, the poverty, the deterioration can be stemmed.
For BATV News, I'm Kenil Gale.
Meanwhile, the Justice Minister is calling for garrisons to be dismantled. He argues that economics should be the case rather than political action. He says that's the preferred way of helping these volatile areas develop.
Minister Chuck says one of 10 recommendations coming out of the Tivoli Commission of Inquiry speaks to putting a stop to garrison operations as it was preventing democracy from being achieved.
The real question is, how do you dismantle it? Because the Commission, in its report, urged that unless you do, the likelihood of those communities developing will be really slim. And they made a number of proposals as to how the garrisons should be dismantled. And quite frankly, when we looked at it, I'm not too sure that they would achieve what they asked us to do.
The minister says there should be public discussion on how to fix these communities. These discussions, he says, must be spearheaded by the political parties.
There are garrisons on both political parties. And I can assure you that as the Commission understood, there are certain constituencies which are considered electorally safe seats for one political party or the other. There's nothing unique or unsavory in that reality. And it is possible, perhaps up to 1990, that you could say that these garrisons, that no voting took place. In other words, even if you live in those areas, you know somebody vote for you.
He's also arguing that economics must be at the forefront of what is being done and the decision should not be influenced by politics.
So somewhere along the line, we have to find ways and means to have these communities become entrepreneurial centers where the young men, dons, and so on can be transformed into business people rather than youngsters as they are now.
For BATV News, I'm Anthony Morgan.
Still to come, manufacturers call for a stable tax environment. More on that after the break. Welcome back. Managing Director of Red Stripe, Ricardo Nuncio, says a stable tax environment is needed if the manufacturing sector is to grow. He says that stability will also ensure the affordability of products. He was a guest on BATV's business discussion show On Point last evening. More in this report.
Ricardo Nuncio says the current tax environment is costing the manufacturing sector. He says that's why Red Stripe is proposing an alternative way for the government to look at the environmental levy.
We do believe that the way that currently the tax is being structured is more of a manufacturer's tax and not so much a tax that incentivizes manufacturers to be promoting better practices to take care of the environment. No?
So the taxes are penalizing manufacturing?
Yes.
Yeah, at the end that's the current situation. And there's no incentive, if you may, for companies that are doing the right things towards the environment.
He says the government should put more focus on compliance rather than continuously raising the taxes.
Across the region, you have a low per capita consumption of alcohol overall, but even lower in beer. And one of the drivers of that low per capita consumption is price. And price is heavily influenced by tax. So when you look at the tax regime that we have here in Jamaica, and when you look at the percentage of excise duties that you pay per dollar, it's quite high. Actually, it's amongst the highest in the region. When you compare it in the Caribbean region, where we operate in other countries, we have the second highest tax regime.
Meanwhile, President of the Jamaica Exporters Association, JEA, Michelle Chong, says a significant amount of attention needs to be placed on how taxes are calculated. She says the complicated process is hindering small businesses.
It is very important for us to bring the smaller and medium-sized companies into the formal system. I don't know how they're going to do the calculation of their own taxes. It's very complicated. And I mean, even at Honeybun, we use very sophisticated software for our accounting, and to program some of the computations that we need to do our taxes requires a lot of consultants just to get that done.
So tax policy is actually keeping SMEs from developing.
Yes, you want to simplify it so people don't have penalties to deal with when they're audited because they misunderstood the tax system.
In the meantime, Ricardo Nuncio is calling for stability in areas which are critical to exports. He says better processes will also allow local manufacturers to be more competitive.
I think there's a way to go still to simplify processes, no? And also guarantee that we have better certainty going forward. For example, just recently we faced an issue on the port, no? Yes. We had a strike at the port based on and on the issue and the waiting time, a significant impact. That had an impact. That had an impact to our business, and it's still a risk that is.
For BATV News, I'm Andrew Laidley.
Over 90% of Jamaicans aren't actively saving for retirement, but two of the island's financial institutions believe education and adequate legislation could be the key factors to changing that. Jason Muyong reports.
Senior Manager at Jamaica National with responsibility for individual retirement scheme and premium financing, Sharon Smith, says statistics show that only about 9% of the working population in the country are a part of an approved retirement scheme. This, she says, will eventually create some challenges for Jamaicans.
It's going to have a heavy strain not only on the working population in the future, but on the elderly and those caregivers to them, because there are several factors that's going to influence that as well. The PIOJ statistics shows that we have an aging population, and that by the year 2050, the persons over 60 are likely to outnumber the child population.
And with more people projected to live longer, Manager at Victoria Mutual Building Society Pensions Administration, Judian Marzuka, agrees that young people will have to pay more taxes to support those without retirement plans. She says it will take some level of education to have persons planning earlier for their retirement.
We just have to, I guess, keep beating on the pavement and educating, making people aware that it has to be a part of that planning from day one. From day one, persons have to plan. Employers need to put things in place for their employees, and people need to take responsibility for ensuring that there is something for them when they do get to that age.
Sharon Smith also agrees that education will play a big part in that process, adding that a little pension that persons are putting away is also not enough.
Under the current laws, you're only allowed 20% of your income, of your gross income for pension plan. Right, to invest in an approved retirement scheme. So if the statistics shows that you really need to start from your first paycheck. You need about 40 years of continuous savings to give you enough income to retire on comfortably at your current lifestyle. So when persons are not doing that, then you understand the burden that we're all likely to face in the future.
Meanwhile, the managers say more robust legislation, which not only covers the eligible 9%, will also be critical going forward.
Isn't the new Pension Act supposed to address some of those issues?
It will, in terms of portability, which means that...
But it's still voluntary, the portability, is it?
No, the portability will be enforced. It means that once you leave your employment and you are
why
contributing...
are we taking so long to put this thing in place?
That's,
Because I've been hearing about it from I was very young, and I'm not so young.
No. Well, the other thing to remember is that the portability will only affect those, that 9% of the Jamaicans that are already part of the pension plan.
Yes.
So what you really need is an overall plan that's going to seriously look at where Jamaica is today.
For BATV News, I'm Jason Muyong.
Local businesses are to benefit from a rebranded Bureau of Standards Jamaica BSJ. The agency will now focus on trade facilitation and business export instead of regulations. The government says the BSJ's new focus will help Jamaican businesses be more competitive in the local and export markets through the use of standards. The shift is part of recommendations from the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development based on a review of the structure and mandate of the BSJ. This prompted the government to separate the BSJ's regulatory function, which has been transferred to the National Compliance and Regulatory Authority. And stay with us, regional and international stories are next. Welcome back. It's time for regional and international news. Against the backdrop of staggering debt, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has advised the Hubert Minnis administration in the Bahamas to make drastic cuts to the country's public sector wage bill. The IMF wants the wage bill to be cut by some $70 million US. At the end of its Article 4 consultation, the IMF issued a report in which it also urged the government to embark on a fiscal consolidation exercise. The multilateral also underscored the need for urgent action to reduce subsidies to state enterprises and the implementation of pension reform. The IMF also raised concerns about what it called lax spending controls ahead of the May 10 general elections. Meanwhile, on the issue of pension reform, the IMF called for civil servants to share the burden of financing their own retirement income. The cost is currently borne 100% by the government. A state of emergency has been declared in the U.S. state of Florida. Thousands of people have arrived from Puerto Rico, where islanders are struggling to get basic necessities after 3 weeks after Hurricane Maria. Al Jazeera's Andy Gallagher reports from Orlando, Florida.
The storm hit 2,000 kilometers from here, but it's at Orlando's International Airport where one of 3 disaster relief centers is providing care and aid for newly arrived Puerto Ricans. The island and homeland they left is still largely without electricity. Fresh water supplies are dwindling, and heading to the U.S. mainland is the only option for many.
I feel so sad and I feel so lonely because I don't have my mom, I don't have my dad, my sister.
It's a day by day, so for us over here, it's our hearts are with them because we wish we could do more, but we can't because, you know, we cannot get power to them or anything.
The economic crisis in Puerto Rico has already prompted hundreds of thousands of residents to leave to find jobs. The aftermath of Hurricane Maria is likely to force many more to follow. In the last few days alone, 30,000 Puerto Ricans have arrived here in Orlando. Statewide, that number could exceed 100,000. But Florida's home to 1 million Puerto Ricans, and this is a community more than willing to lend a helping hand. But President Trump's latest tweets, effectively threatening to abandon long-term aid, haven't gone down well.
Here we have a lot of different items, from diapers.
Emily Bonilla is Orange County's first Puerto Rican commissioner. She's helping organize aid and says the president's comments are offensive.
I think it's a threat. We've seen him make threats now to the NFL, and it seems to be the way he tries to get things done his way. And he's getting a lot of criticism from Puerto Rico, and that's his way of saying, stop criticizing me.
San Juan's mayor speaks for many when she made a statement asking all Americans to stand together to support the people of Puerto Rico. Politics aside, here in Orlando, volunteers from across the state are helping any way they can.
As you see, we don't have any electricity or water here, but people are like sweating, and when people get tired, someone yell like, "This is better than what's happening in Puerto Rico." So the people is like the gasoline and the adrenaline of the people is think about the situation that our people are having in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico will need help for months to come, and even if the president isn't committed, people here are. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Orlando, Florida.
The leaders of Canada and Mexico have vowed to work on a trade deal that benefits both countries as well as the U.S. They met in Mexico City, but the future of the three-country NAFTA arrangement is still unclear. Al Jazeera's John Holman reports from Mexico City.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau arrived in Mexico straight from Washington, D.C., top of the agenda with President Enrique Peña Nieto, just as it had been with Donald Trump. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which binds the US, Canada and Mexico, is being renegotiated. But the US is increasingly playing hardball with the other two. President Trump himself has said many times the deal is unfair and has threatened to pull out. Both Canada and Mexico's leaders say if it's updated, it can still work.
Mexico wants a good agreement, but it has to be positive for the three countries. It can't just be good for one or the other.
As we move forward with renegotiations, we will continue to work toward our shared goal of a win-win-win agreement.
Mexico and Canada are for the moment presenting a fairly united front, but in reality they're in two very different positions. Just last year, the United States had a more than $60 billion trade deficit with Mexico. In comparison, Canada and the US have a much more balanced trade relationship. There are concerns in Mexico that if negotiations stall, the two developed countries in the bloc could forge their own deal.
I think Trudeau is playing his cards well. Presenting himself now as close to Mexico means he can negotiate in Canada's interests. But there's the danger that at some point the Canadian Prime Minister sees that the best thing for his country is a bilateral deal with the US.
As US negotiators talk tougher, the Mexican government was at pains this week to say they too could walk away.
If necessary, we will leave the treaty. Mexico is bigger than NAFTA.
The country says it's looking to develop trade with other regions, but about 80% of its exports head to the US, especially cars from the country's booming auto industry. Ultimately, it's that dependence and not the relationship with Canada that's Mexico's biggest concern. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Environmentalists say Asia's electronic waste has jumped by 63% in the last 5 years. Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown tells us more.
The village of Dayaopu in northeast China was once part of a burgeoning illegal industry. It still survives, just. For years, unskilled local people made a living picking apart electronic waste by hand, extracting metals like gold, silver and copper, and anything else that offered value. Oblivious of the dangers to their health or to the village's water and soil. This contamination will last for years. Slowly, these unregulated workshops have started to close. As we took these pictures, a local government official appeared, and unusually for China, he agreed to an on-the-spot interview.
The state is getting stricter and stricter on all types of pollution, which are harmful to human beings. As a result of these new regulations, a lot of workshops here cannot survive.
For decades, places like this existed for one reason only: the dirty and dangerous job of processing electronic waste. But recently, the government started to close down some of these illegal workshops, and everyone's now being moved to a new official recycling plant just down the road, where we're told conditions are much safer.
While this illicit trade survives, much of the hazardous work now happens in e-waste processing centres. This is one of more than 100 now operating across the country, handling mostly old TVs. Drilled apart by hand, it is still dirty work. But here, at least, workers have a measure of protection from the dust and toxic fumes. More and more recycling workshops are being forced to move into such purpose-built facilities.
China has made a great deal of progress on the treatment of electronic waste in the past decade. At this plant, we are now able to process more than 80 million household electrical appliances a year.
And as the middle class in China and the rest of Asia continues to grow, so too will the workload at plants like this one. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera in China.
Talking Stocks is after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Time now for Talking Stocks. 39 stocks traded today, of which 16 advanced, 15 declined, and 8 traded firm. The main JC index advanced 4,898 points to close at 273,664. The junior index also advanced 7 points to close at 2,916 points. Over 6 million units traded, valued at more than $79 million on the Jamaican dollar market. And on the US dollar market, more than 425,000 units traded, valued at over 102,000 US dollars. Jamaica Stock Exchange, with over 1 million units changing hands, accounted for 16% of the market volume. JMMB Group, 7.50%, was second with 870,000 units trading. JMMB Cumulative Renewables, 7.5%, accounted for more than 700,000 US units, amounting to 10% of the market volume crossing the floor. Jamaica Stock Exchange was a top advancer, up $1.15 to close at $7.20, followed by T-Tech, up 95 cents to close at $6.99, and the JMMB Group, up $2.95 to close at $26.01. The main decliners were Key Insurance Company, down 49 cents to close at $3.51, followed by Barita Investments, losing 90 cents to close at $8.01, and Maybury Investments, down 40 cents to close at $4.10. And that's all the news we have for this evening. But before we go, a recap of our top story. IMF's mission chief to Jamaica, Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan, says she's disappointed with the island's recent growth figures and increased poverty. Thanks for watching. For more content, visit our website at batvja.com. I'm Andrew Laidley. Pleasant viewing.